Recovered from the personal effects of Thomas Henry Ashworth, British Red Cross Voluntary Aid Detachment, attached to the KUK 4th Army Medical Corps. Sealed by direct order of Colonel Physician Ernst Drabeck, November 29, 1914. Classification: Medical Anomaly, Non-Dissemination Order in effect. Unsealed without note or accompanying documentation. Krakow Garrison Archive, March 1921. October 14, 1914. There are men who would tell you that what I am about to record is the product of extreme fatigue, of the particular deterioration that sustained exposure to the conditions of the Eastern Front in that first autumn of the war reliably produced in men otherwise of sound mind. I do not dispute that I was exhausted. I had not slept more than 4 consecutive hours in any 24-hour period since the beginning of October. I had been working in conditions that no medical school in Britain or on the continent had prepared its graduates to face. I had watched men die in numbers and at velocities that the textbooks had not accounted for, and I had witnessed enough in the preceding 10 weeks to place me, by any reasonable clinical assessment, at the outer boundary of my functional reserves. I record this not as a disclaimer but because it is part of the truth, and because the truth, the whole truth, including all of its most inconvenient elements, is the only reason these pages exist. My name is Thomas Henry Ashworth. I am 26 years of age. I hold the position of Field Medic, Voluntary Aid Detachment, British Red Cross, attached in an observational capacity to the Imperial and Royal Austro-Hungarian Army's 4th Medical Corps since the 2nd week of August, 1914, under the operational umbrella of the 4th Army's Medical Administration east of Jarosław. This account constitutes my testimony regarding the events that took place in and around the village of Brezów, in the Galician lowlands approximately 18 kilometers southeast of Jarosław, between the 17th and 19th of October, 1914. I have been instructed not to write this testimony. I have been instructed by men of sufficient rank to give that instruction legal weight, and I have, for nearly 7 years, complied with it out of a combination of professional obligation, personal uncertainty, and, if I am prepared to be entirely honest with myself, fear. I am no longer complying. The men who gave the instruction are no longer in positions from which they can enforce it, and there is a version of these events circulating in the classified medical literature under a heading that renders it effectively invisible, and that version is wrong in every material particular. What I saw in the village of Brezów was not the product of a novel environmental pathogen. It was not the product of mass psychological trauma or of gas exposure, or of any mechanism the men who wrote the official summary have proposed. The changed, and that is the word I will use throughout, the word Petrov used, the nearest English rendering of the Ukrainian term he gave me, were real. I saw them. I was there. I am the only surviving member of the 7-person detachment that entered Brezów on the morning of October the 17th who is both living and willing to say openly what we found. That is the context for everything that follows. The orders reached me before dawn on the 16th, delivered by Feldwebel Oskar Brenner in the close, overworked warmth of the field hospital established in a commandeered granary on the western outskirts of Jarosław. The facility was operating at something approaching 3 times its design capacity, the consequence of the Austro-Hungarian retreat across the San River, the catastrophic 9th Corps losses at the end of September, the steady westward pressure of the Russian advance through the eastern Galician plain. I had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours on a folded stretcher beneath a trestle table, wrapped in my greatcoat with my medical satchel pressed against my side as a bolster, and Brenner found me with a lantern held at chest height and the expression of a man for whom the delivery of unpleasant news has long since ceased to require any particular emotional calibration. He was a stocky, humorless Lower Austrian who had spent 20 years in the Imperial Army, and he handed me the folded paper and waited with the patience of a man who is certain patience will be required and extends it without warmth. The order was brief and precisely uninformative in the manner of documents that have been written by people who prefer not to describe directly the thing they are directing others to address. It directed me to proceed, with a detachment whose composition would be confirmed at the 6 o'clock briefing, to the village of Brezów, 18 kilometers southeast, and to assess the condition of the survivors of the 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol, 7th Jaeger Regiment, who had returned to the forward picket at Wolka Mala in a state described, and I read the phrase twice, as requiring immediate medical evaluation. In a war where requiring immediate medical evaluation was the chronic baseline condition of a substantial fraction of the men I encountered on any given day, the fact that a specific medical observer and an armed escort had been directed to assess a group of returning soldiers told me considerably more than the order's language was willing to say out loud. I put the paper in my breast pocket, laced my boots, and told Brenner I would be ready by 6. The detachment assembled in the granary yard at first light, all 7 of us breathing small clouds into the cold that had settled over the flat ground overnight. Oberleutnant Franz Kettner commanded, a lean, precise young officer of perhaps 23 with a Rothschild pistol at his hip and a rolled sector map under his arm, and the careful, trained authority of a man who has been well prepared for how to behave and has not yet encountered conditions that training does not address. His face had the quality of controlled composure that I would come, over the following days, to understand was not composure so much as the active maintenance of a surface under which something more uncertain was operating. The 4 riflemen were all veterans of the Galician campaign, Gefreiter Mance, broad-shouldered and Tyrolean, who carried his manliture with the unself-conscious ease of a man for whom a service rifle had been a constant domestic companion since adolescence. Gefreiter Hollweg, dark, Moravian, economical to the point of near disappearance with words and motion. Infanterist Rath, the youngest of the group, who carried in his bearing the involuntary hypervigilance of a man whose nervous system had been recalibrated by sustained artillery exposure and had not yet found its way back to its previous settings. And Infanterist Vogel, a former gamekeeper, heavy-browed and deliberate, who moved through landscape with the reading, attentive stillness of a man more practiced in observation than in infantry tactics, and whose eyes, I noticed early on, were always on the ground and the mid-distance simultaneously. The 7th member of the party was Petrov, our civilian interpreter, a Ruthenian of perhaps 50, gray-bearded, with careful eyes and the practiced, non-committal bearing of a man who has spent his adult life in the space between competing national authorities and has learned to inhabit that space with great precision. We rode on a commandeered farm cart for 12 kilometers, until the mud of the track became impassable even for the single remaining horse, and then continued on foot. By the time we reached the forward picket at Wolka Mala, it was past 10 o'clock and the October sky had settled to a featureless, lightless gray that pressed down on the flat farmland with an almost physical weight, shrinking the visible horizon, reducing the world around us to a radius that felt calibrated to prevent the eye from finding anything reassuring in the distance. Unteroffizier Hecht met us at the edge of the picket position, a sandbagged enclosure beside the ruins of a farmhouse, manned by 6 soldiers of the 7th Jaeger. He was wire-thin and pale-eyed and conducting himself with the rigid precision of a man whose composure is a structure he is actively sustaining rather than an innate characteristic. His handshake, when he gave it to Kettner, was not entirely steady, and I noted it without comment the way that medical observation becomes automatic after sufficient exposure. The 6 men of his picket had positioned themselves, without any order to do so that I could identify, in the far corner of the enclosure, away from the farmhouse, backs to the earthwork, faces toward the building, in the involuntary geometry of men who do not wish to be approached from a direction they cannot watch. It was the posture of animals that are aware of a threat they cannot name and cannot face, and it told me more, in that first minute, than anything Hecht subsequently said. He told us that the 4 survivors of the 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol were inside the farmhouse, that they had arrived at the position at approximately 2:30 in the morning, 3 days after departing for Brezów on a routine mapping and intelligence gathering assignment. The patrol had comprised 9 men, 4 had returned. He had placed them inside the farmhouse because, and here his composure fractured, minutely, in a way I believe was involuntary, because he did not know where else to put them. I asked him to describe their condition. He was silent for a moment in a way that suggested the question required him to revisit something from which he had been maintaining a careful distance. Then he said in the flat, affect-stripped register of a man reciting from a prepared statement, "They are silent, they do not eat or drink, they do not respond to questions or to movement, 2 have wounds that required immediate treatment and have not sought treatment, they arrived oriented in the direction of Brezów and 3 of them have not moved since arriving." I asked what he meant specifically by have not moved. He said he meant that since arriving, 3 of the 4 had not moved. I picked up my medical satchel and asked Heck to take me to them. The farmhouse interior smelled of damp plaster and old smoke and something else, something underneath those ordinary smells, something I categorized tentatively as organic, biological, of living matter in a state of alteration, but which I could not identify with any precision in that initial moment. Light came through a collapsed section of roof and through 2 intact windows. The 4 men of the 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol were in the main room. 2 were standing. 2 were seated on the remains of a wooden bench against the far wall. All 4 were oriented toward the east wall, oriented, as Hecht had said, in the direction of Brezów. They did not respond to our entry. Not to my voice when I introduced myself, not to Kettner's boots on the floorboards, not to my hand passing before their faces. I worked through a clinical assessment on all 4 men, taking notes in the small notebook I carried in my breast pocket. The results were consistent across all 4. Skin temperature cold with a thoroughness and uniformity that was incompatible with any normal presentation of exposure or shock. Cold in the manner of objects, cold without gradient, cold as though the relationship between the tissue and the metabolic generation of heat had been severed at some fundamental level rather than merely disrupted. Pulse rates between 38 and 43 beats per minute. Regular rhythms. Fixed gaze. Complete and total absence of pain response, including in the 2 men with wounds, one a deep laceration to the left forearm with clean, straight margins indicating a blade or wire injury, the other a penetrating wound to the right thigh that should, in any ordinary analysis, have resulted in fatal blood loss within hours if not immediately treated, and yet the man was standing and the wound was not bleeding, and he was not in any distress I could detect by any means available to me. Both wounds were closed. Not healed, not granulating, not showing any of the inflammatory processes that a 3-day wound of that depth would be demonstrating under any normal physiological circumstance. The wound edges had simply adhered. The tissue had pressed itself together and sealed, leaving pale, slightly elevated lines of closure that were cold to probing, entirely insensate under pressure that would have produced unambiguous pain responses in any person retaining normal neurological function, and that looked like nothing I had encountered in any emergency, surgical, or pathological context in my training or practice. There was no inflammation, no warmth at the wound margins, no redness, no sign of any immune or cellular response. The absence of the inflammatory response in a 3-day wound is not a sign of effective healing. It is a sign that the processes which constitute healing have ceased. I straightened up from the last man and looked at the 4 of them standing and sitting in their eastward orientation, and then I walked back to Kettner in the doorway and told him, in a voice I made as level as I could, that I had no diagnosis, that the findings were inconsistent with any pathological state I was familiar with, and that we needed to proceed to Brezów, because whatever had produced this had produced it there. In the yard, with Hecht and Petrov close enough to hear everything, I walked Kettner through the clinical findings and told him what I thought they meant, which was that I did not know what they meant except that they were significant and that they had a source. Kettner listened with his arms folded and his face in its careful neutral register, and when I had finished he said that our orders were to assess the condition of the returned survivors, which we had now done. I said that an unexplained pathological event affecting military personnel in an active theater of operations was, in my professional judgment, something that required investigation at its origin. Petrov, who had been standing 3 feet away with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes on the middle distance, spoke before Kettner could answer. He spoke in Ukrainian first, quietly, as though saying the thing in his own language before he committed to a translation, and then he said in German, "The old people in this part of Galicia have always known that there are places where the dead and the living are not properly separated. Brezów has been one of those places for a long time. On the eastern edge of the village there is a burial mound." He paused and gave a Ukrainian word that I rendered in my notebook as something approximating kurin, which he told me denoted an earthwork burial site of the kind common in the steppe regions, older than the village, older than the church, older than any faith that anyone in this part of Europe has practiced in recorded memory. The people of Brezów understood that this mound required careful management. They did not dig near it. They maintained a defined perimeter within which no new burials were made. They observed certain practices at certain times of year, the specifics of which Petrov declined to detail. And most importantly, they did not bring the newly dead near it. When the Russian artillery came through in September, these practices were suspended by the violence and urgency of evacuation. What the shelling did to the mound, Petrov did not know. He had not been there. But he was telling me this now before we went because he thought I should know it. I asked him what he thought the things from the mound did to people who encountered them. He said they drew the living toward the source, that they transmitted their condition through direct contact, and perhaps through sustained proximity, that the people who came near enough became, over hours or days, like what I had described in the farmhouse, present in body, but absent from everything that made presence more than a physical fact. Cold, slow, oriented. I asked him if this was reversible. He said he had never known it to be reversed. He said nothing further and fell back a step. Kettner looked at his map for a long moment. Then he said that we would proceed to Brezów and complete an assessment and be back at this position before dark. He said it with the quiet finality of a man who has already made a decision and is framing it as a plan. We left Wolkomala at 11:30. I did not look back at the farmhouse as we walked away from it, but I was conscious of it behind me, of the 4 men inside, standing and sitting facing east, for the entire first mile of the journey. The road southeast had been processed by the passage of 2 armies into a deeply rutted channel of gray-brown mud between fields that had been productive agricultural land in a previous life and were now simply damaged terrain waiting to be one thing or another. We walked in single file in the cold and the flat light, and for the most part nobody spoke. The silence of the plain around us was the silence of a landscape drained of ordinary life. No livestock, no birds that I could hear, no movement at the periphery of the plowed fields we passed except for the occasional shift of a skeletal hedgerow in a wind too light to feel on the skin. After perhaps half an hour, Petrov fell into step beside me and spoke without looking at me, in the low lateral manner of a man conveying something he prefers not to be seen conveying. He gave me the Ukrainian word for what the people of this region had always understood the Brezów mound to produce. He rendered it phonetically for me as nezhivi, the unliving, or more literally as he explained it, the ones who neither live nor stop. He said that the people of Brezów had known for generations that the mound at their eastern edge required active maintenance of separation from the living. There had been instances in living memory where the practices had lapsed: a hard winter, a family that arrived without knowledge of the local rules, a burial made carelessly too close to the perimeter, and in each case the results had been consistent with what the region's people had always described, and with what I had observed in the farmhouse at Wolkomala. The changed, as he called them, were not aggressive in the way that the word aggression usually implies. They did not attack. They drew. The living who came near enough were pulled by some mechanism Petrov could not explain and did not attempt to rationalize toward the source, and the proximity of the source worked on the living in the way that he described, and the change was, once begun, a direction and not a state. It progressed toward something, toward the complete condition of the things in the mound, and it did not naturally reverse. I asked him what the things in the mound looked like. He was quiet for a moment. He said he had never seen them himself, that he was telling me what the old people of this part of Galicia had described across generations, that the descriptions were consistent. He said, tall, pale in a way beyond paleness, moving in the manner of something that understands locomotion as a concept and is producing it by force of intention rather than by the integrated function of living musculature, which is to say, wrongly, jerkingly, by sudden lurches that cover distance without the visual logic that walking has when performed by something alive. I wrote this in my notebook. We walked on in silence. After a further 20 minutes, at the crest of a low ridge in the otherwise flat ground, Vogel, who had been at the rear of the column since we left the picket, moving with his gamekeeper's reading of terrain, said in a voice that was careful and level, "There is the village." We stopped. We looked. Brezów lay in a shallow depression 300 meters below us. It was a small settlement, perhaps 30 structures, a church with a small dome, the remains of a mill beside a silted mill race, farmhouses and outbuildings of the low, broad-roofed Eastern Galician type built to outlast hard winters. The village had been shelled. Several buildings on the northern edge showed the characteristic damage of artillery impact, collapsed walls and exposed timbers and the dark staining of old fire. None of this was unusual, we had passed through worse. What was unusual was the quality of the village's stillness, and I am aware that the word quality is doing too much work in that sentence and that I need to be precise. A shelled and evacuated village in a war zone is quiet, but it is quiet in the way of an absence. The absence of people, of livestock, of the background noise of habitation. The quiet of Brezów was different from an absence. It was heavier than that. It was the quality of a place where the silence itself was present, was occupying the space rather than merely characterizing it. A silence that had weight, that pressed against the ear from outside rather than arising from the ear's failure to receive input. I cannot make this observation in clinical terms. I can only record that I perceived it, and that Mance, who was standing to my left, made a low involuntary sound that was not a word, and that Rath, behind me, had unslung his manliture without receiving any instruction to do so. Kettner raised his field glasses and studied the village for a long moment, and then he said we would proceed in close formation, no separation of more than 5 meters, no one to enter any structure alone. We descended the ridge and walked into Brezów. The cold was worse in the village than it had been on the open plain. More than could be accounted for by shadow or by the depression in the ground. It had the quality of intent that I described earlier when I described the silence, and I record this knowing that it is the least defensible element of my account in scientific terms and accepting that its indefensibility does not alter its accuracy. We checked the first 6 structures quickly and methodically: 4 farmhouses, a tool shed, a small structure that had been a shop of some kind. All emptied in haste. Bedding left on floors, cooking implements still on shelves, a child's wooden shoe beside a kitchen door, a sheaf of papers on a table that the departure of their owner had not paused to collect. We did not speak much as we cleared the structures. Holweg and Vogel worked together with a mechanical thoroughness that betrayed nothing, and Rath's hypervigilance, which under normal conditions I might have viewed as a liability, seemed appropriate here. His eyes covered ground that the others did not, and it was Rath who stopped us in the second farmhouse and pointed at the floor. Footprints in the dried mud, 2 sets, both military boot pattern, both oriented toward the rear of the structure, neither returning. Recent enough to be distinct. Vogel crouched over them with the gamekeeper's attention, and said they were Austro-Hungarian infantry pattern, made within the last 48 hours. Kettner had his lamp out. We followed the prints to a door at the rear of the farmhouse, which opened on a short wooden ladder descending to a root cellar, and Kettner went down first with the lamp, and below we found 2 men. They were crouched in the far corner of the cellar with their knees drawn up and their rifles across their laps and their eyes catching the lamplight with a brightness that had more of an animal's panic in it than a person's recognition. And for one terrible second the wrongness of their eyes stopped my heart, and then one of them said Kettner's rank and the word identification, which is what an Austro-Hungarian soldier says when challenged in a dark place and wants not to be shot, and I breathed again. They were Infanterist Brouwer and Infanterist Sachs of the 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol, identifiable by collar markings and by their own urgent and immediate self-identification. They had been in the cellar for 2 days. They had descended and barricaded the trapdoor on the evening of October the 15th and had not come out. Between them they had a tin of biscuits and a canteen of water rationed with severe discipline. They were cold and deeply hungry and visibly exhausted in the profound way of men who have not slept because sleep was not possible rather than because they lacked the opportunity, and they were, and this is the thing I registered first and most sharply, in the way that medical observation goes directly to what is most acutely relevant, entirely themselves. Brouwer's skin was warm. His pulse, which I checked immediately and to which he submitted without any question, was elevated in the 90s, the tachycardia of prolonged cold and stress, but it was elevated in the correct direction, fast rather than devastatingly slow, and it responded when I released his wrist in the way that a normal pulse responds to the removal of the point of measurement, with a slight variability rather than with the mechanical regularity of a clock. His eyes tracked. He responded to his name. When Kettner confirmed there were 7 of us in the cellar, all present and responsive, Brouwer's face changed in a way I found almost more difficult to watch than any of the things that had preceded it. The collapse of an enormous, sustained effort of control, the release that comes from the realization that another person is there, and the state of absolute solitary terror is, even if only briefly interrupted. He was a large man with a square jaw and a broken nose, and he put his face in his large hands for perhaps 10 seconds, and when he lifted it again he had composed himself and he said, "You need to know what happened here. You need to know now, before it gets dark." Brouwer told it in the clipped, structural sentences of a man who has been a soldier long enough to know how to make a report and who is making one because it is the only frame available to him that does not buckle under the weight of the content. Sachs confirmed what he had witnessed and was silent through the rest. The patrol had entered Brezów on the evening of October the 14th, 4 days before our arrival. The village was empty as expected. The civilian population had evacuated in September when the Russian advance came through. The patrol's objective was to document structural damage from the shelling, assess any remaining military infrastructure, and sweep for Russian stragglers. They had established their patrol base in the largest intact farmhouse, posted sentries, and begun their assessment in the remaining daylight. Feldwebel Dorn, the patrol commander, had sent 2 men, Gefreiter Wachter and Infanterist Kern, to check the eastern edge of the village toward the mill and the fields beyond. They did not return within the expected 30 minutes. Dorn sent 2 more to locate them. They did not return either. Dorn assembled the remaining 5 men and went east himself. They found Wachter and Kern standing approximately 50 meters beyond the last house of the village at the edge of a large, dark field. Standing still, facing east. In the field beyond them, 200 meters away at the far end, was the mound. It was lower than Brouwer had expected. Not dramatic, not imposing, just a long dark swelling in the earth that the shelling had opened at its southern edge, a dark wound in the grass that exposed something pale beneath. Between the mound and the place where Wachter and Kern were standing, there were figures. Brouwer paused at this point. I asked him to describe them. He looked at the cellar wall and then at me and said, "Too tall. The color of old wax or of skin that has never in its whole existence been exposed to the sun." They moved by sudden lurches. A lurch, a pause, a lurch, as if locomotion was something they were accomplishing by intent rather than by function, the way a person might move a limb that has gone to sleep by commanding it rather than feeling it. There were 8 of them, perhaps 10, in the gray evening light between the mound and the 2 standing soldiers. Wachter and Kern did not respond when Dorn called their names. Dorn pulled Wachter by the shoulder to turn him, and the shoulder moved but the body offered neither resistance nor assistance, and when Dorn stepped in front of him to look at his face, Wachter's eyes were open and fixed past Dorn toward the mound, and his skin was cold and his pulse was there but it was wrong. Dorn said this, "The pulse is there but it's wrong." He had been a soldier for 12 years and he knew how to check a pulse, and he knew that what he was feeling was wrong. At this moment one of the tall figures at the mound began to move toward them. Not quickly, but without hesitation and without any of the qualities of movement that suggest the mover might stop. The others began to move as well. Dorn gave the order to retreat. Brouwer and Sachs ran. Dorn and 2 others, Infanterist Farbach and Gefreiter Lutz, did not run immediately. Brouwer heard shouting behind him as he ran. He heard a rifle shot, then a second. He heard Farbach scream, a short scream that stopped with a completeness that sounds carry when they stop because the person producing them is no longer in a condition to continue. He did not hear Lutz at all after the first shot. He and Sachs ran to the patrol base and took their packs and descended to the cellar and barricaded the trapdoor and had not opened it since. He did not know what had become of Dorn, Farbach, or Lutz. He did not know what had become of Wachter and Kern after what they had already become. He knew what the figures moved like at pace, faster than their lurching suggested they could move, much faster when they chose to cover ground with intention. He said this last thing carefully, the way a man states a fact he knows will be difficult to process, and then he said, "The light is getting lower and you should know that they are worse in low light." I looked at the narrow windows of the cellar. The light had the quality of late afternoon. I estimated 40 minutes of useful daylight remaining. Kettner was already at the base of the ladder. We came out of the cellar at speed. Kettner made the decision without debate and without asking for opinions. We would take Brouwer and Sachs and leave Brezów by the same route we had entered, and we would be on the open plain and moving toward Wielka Mala before the light failed. It was the correct decision and it was made in time, and we very nearly executed it entirely. We were perhaps 100 meters from the edge of the village, moving along the main track in close formation, Mance at the front, Vogel at the rear walking backward with his manlicher at his shoulder, when Rath, who had been on Mance's right watching the structures to the north, said in a voice stripped of all inflection, "They are behind us." I turned. There were 4 of them on the track between our position and the eastern quarter of the village. They were standing still in the middle of the track as if they had simply been placed there. They were as Brouwer had described, tall beyond the range of human height, pale with the particular wax-colored pallor of something that has been in the earth for an unknowable duration and has not, in all that time, been touched by light. Their clothing was wrong in a way I struggled, even in that moment, to articulate beyond the observation that it was not clothing from any period of the last several generations, that it predated by an order of magnitude the village, the church, the particular shape of Galician peasant culture that had built those farmhouses and left those objects on those shelves. One of them moved. It lurched. The lurch covered a meter. It stopped. It lurched again. The sound of my own breathing was very loud. Petrov was saying something in Ukrainian in a rapid, rhythmic, low voice that had the cadence of memorized words. Prayer, or something serving the function that prayer serves in the presence of something for which no other frame exists. Mance had his manlicher at his shoulder with his cheek on the stock and his hands entirely, improbably steady, and this steadiness under the circumstances was one of the most remarkable things I witnessed during the entirety of those 2 days. Kettner said, in a voice that was quiet and perfectly controlled and sounded about 40 years older than his face, "Move." We moved. We moved at the best pace we could manage without breaking formation, which Kettner insisted on, Vogel walking backward, watching the track behind us, his rifle following. Mance fired from a moving walk when the nearest figure lurched to within 30 meters. A centermass shot, accurate. I saw the impact, saw the figure's body move with it, and the figure paused for 3 seconds and then lurched forward again. Holweg fired twice at a second figure that had appeared between 2 buildings on our left flank. Both shots struck it. It went to one knee, and then, with the measured, mechanical deliberateness of something for which the concept of incapacitation does not apply, it came back upright. Brouwer, who had been running in disciplined silence, shouted something from the middle of the column that I could not parse as language. Sachs ran with his face forward and his rifle at the trail, and the economy of movement of a man whose consciousness has reduced itself to the absolute minimum necessary for continued forward motion. The edge of the village. The first open ground. The track becoming the road across the plain, the light now at the horizon, the gray sky exchanging itself for the deep, lightless gray of early darkness. We ran. Behind us, at the moment we passed the last building and struck the open ground of the plain, I heard a sound. I will not describe it except to record that it was not a sound produced by any mechanism I can classify as living in the biological sense. That it carried, rather than occupied, space. That it was felt as much as heard, at the base of the spine and at the back of the skull simultaneously, in a register below hearing and below language, and that I have felt it, in diminishing but unfading echoes, on many nights in the years since that evening in Brezów. I did not look back until we were over the ridge and the village was below and behind us. When I looked back, there was nothing on the plain between us and the ridge. Either the things did not pursue beyond the village, or they did not pursue at pace when they no longer needed to. Neither explanation was, in the moment, adequate. We reached Wolkomala at 9 in the evening. The journey that had taken us less than an hour in the morning took nearly 3 hours in the dark over the mud road, moving without light in a condition of sustained physiological alertness that is more exhausting than physical labor and drains the body of reserves in ways that rest alone does not replenish. Kettner sent Rath ahead with word of our approach so that Hecht's men would not fire on us coming out of the dark. Hecht received us without words. His men were all awake. None of them had slept, I learned, since the 4 changed soldiers arrived 2 nights before. In the farmhouse, the 4 men of the 3rd patrol were exactly as we had left them. Orientations unchanged, temperature unchanged, pulse rates unchanged, eyes still fixed east. Petrov stood in the doorway and looked at them for a long time without entering. Then he turned and said to me, in a voice from which all effect had been carefully and deliberately removed, "The mound must be destroyed. Completely, not suppressed. If the mound is destroyed, The contents of it burn to the condition where nothing remains that can be said to persist. The anchor is broken. He paused. He said, "The ones who are anchored may come to their deaths when the anchor breaks." He said this in the tone of a man for whom this outcome represents mercy, and having looked at the 4 men in that farmhouse, I was willing to accept it as one. Kettner had been listening from 3 feet away. He said nothing for a long moment, and then he said that a runner would go to Jarosław tonight and return in the morning with field incendiary materials from the tactical denial stores, and that we would return to Brezów at first light with sufficient kerosene to burn everything to the foundation line. He said this with the quiet finality of a decision that had already been made in some deeper part of him than the part that formulates plans, and nobody argued with it, and nobody was asked to. I wrote in my notebook by lamp for 2 hours, recording everything I had seen and heard and measured. Then I slept. We returned to Brezów on the morning of the 18th with Kettner's original 7 for additional men, and a cart carrying 8 kerosene canisters. The village was still in the gray morning. The silence and the cold were the same. Nobody who had been there the previous day needed to be told twice about formation or about keeping formation. Kettner had assigned specific structures to each pair, and each pair went to their structure quickly and without discussion, distributing kerosene along the base of the exterior and interior walls and across the floors, and was back at the center of the track within 20 minutes. Vogel and I worked together in the wordless efficiency of men performing a task that requires no commentary. We did not go near the eastern quarter. We did not go near the field with the mound. We distributed the kerosene to the limit of where we could work in clear sight of each other, and then we fell back and Kettner gave the order, and Mance put a flare into the nearest structure, and we fell back further, and the fire took. The structures of Brezów were old and dry, and the kerosene was generous, and the fire took with a speed and completeness that felt, in the moment, proportionate, the right speed, the right completeness, as though the village understood that it was being ended and offered no resistance. We fell back to the ridge and watched it. The fire spread east. Within 40 minutes it had reached the field. The smoke that rose from the far eastern end of the fire, from the direction of the mound, was different in color and texture from the smoke produced by the burning buildings, denser, darker, with a quality of substance to it that the building smoke did not have, and with a smell that I will record only as unlike anything I encountered before or after in my life, neither pleasant nor unpleasant in the terms those words ordinarily operate, simply entirely other, entirely outside the register of anything I had a previous category for. When that smoke reached us on the ridge, several of the additional men who had not been in the village the previous day moved upwind without being told to. Petrov did not move. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the fire with the expression of a man watching a long overdue conclusion arrive, and after perhaps 20 minutes he closed his eyes and kept them closed for a long moment, and then he opened them and said to no one in particular, "It is done." I asked him how he knew. He said, "You can feel when an anchor breaks, the way you feel when a sound stops. Not the sound itself, the absence where it was." He did not look at me when he said this. I wrote it in my notebook, the notebook that Drabek subsequently took. I have the phrases from it still, in the loose notes I made during the 3 days following our return, which were not collected, and which are the structural skeleton on which this account is built. At Wolka Mala, one of Hecht's men checked the farmhouse at 11 o'clock in the morning of the 18th. He came back out and told Kettner that the 4 men were on the floor. Fully dead, not in the in-between state, not cold and slow and present in the terrible middle way they had been, but dead in the absolute and unambiguous sense. Cold, stiff, fully complete, lying on the floor where they had stood and sat for 3 days, their faces turned east and their eyes still open and fixed on the wall with the same orientation they had held since arriving, but fixed now on nothing, no longer on a direction but simply on a surface, in the way of the dead rather than the change. We buried them at the edge of the picket position with the shovels Kettner's men had brought. I read what seemed right to say over them, which was not from any particular text but from whatever remained of the person I had been before the 16th of October, and Hecht's men stood at attention in the cold, and nobody wept, but several men who had not wept for other deaths that autumn stood at the edges of their composure in a way I had not seen before. I gave my account to Colonel Physician Ernst Drabeck in his office in the Commandeered Corps Medical Headquarters in Jarosław on the evening of the 18th. He listened to everything without interrupting and without changing his expression, and when I had finished he said he would need my notebook and all written materials relating to the incident. I gave him the notebook, the primary one in which I had recorded the clinical findings and observations. The loose notes I had made on separate paper during the preceding days were not mentioned and were not collected. Drabeck told me that the official record of the Brezów engagement would reflect a patrol ambush by irregular Russian-aligned forces, that the deaths of the 5 soldiers of the 3rd Reconnaissance Patrol and the 4 soldiers at Wielka Mala would be recorded accordingly, that the burning of the village would be attributed to standard tactical denial protocol, and that the medical findings I had described would be documented under the classification heading of an unidentified environmental pathogen, Umweltgift, environmental poison, a compound word that in German has the satisfying quality of sounding like an explanation without being one. He told me that I was a British national in a guest detachment, that my continued access to the Corps was at the discretion of command, and that he was certain I understood the importance of consistent documentation in an active theater. He said all of this in a tone that was not threatening in any direct sense and was entirely threatening in every practical one. I shook his hand. I left the office. I went to the privy at the end of the corridor and was sick for some time, and then I washed my face with the cold water in the basin and looked at myself in the fragment of mirror above it for longer than I ordinarily spent looking at my own face, looking for the person I had been at 6 o'clock in the granary yard on the morning of the 16th, when I had believed that the rules of the world I inhabited were the rules I understood. That person was not entirely gone. The distance from him had increased. I was transferred to the 2nd Medical Corps in January of 1915 and served on the Eastern Front until November of that year, when shrapnel took a section of my left shoulder and sent me west. I was debriefed by British Red Cross Command in March of 1916, and told, in the indirect but clear language of a letter signed by a War Office official whose name I will not record here, that the Brezów incident was a matter of Allied operational security that had received appropriate resolution and required no further discussion from any party. I complied for 7 years, in the way that people comply with instructions that they fear rather than respect, and that compliance has cost me something I cannot recover by ending it now. What it has cost me is the ability to sleep without, at some point in the small hours, returning to the eastern wall of the Wielka Mala farmhouse and the 4 men standing and sitting in it, their skin cold, their pulses impossibly slow, their faces turned toward a direction from which no help was coming and toward which no good thing awaited them. Men who had been soldiers and fathers and sons and were no longer contained by any of those words. Anchored to a destroyed place by something that had been in the earth of the Galician lowlands for longer than any living person can calculate, drawn out into the world by the catastrophic and perfectly indifferent violence of a war that did not know and did not care what its shells were disturbing when they fell on a field east of Brezów in September of 1914. The fire worked. Petrov was right, and the anchor broke, and the 4 soldiers at Wielka Mala came to their final deaths, and whatever had been sealed in that mound for however many centuries was consumed in the burning. I believe this. I hold to it in the manner of a man holding a rope above a drop. Not because it is comfortable to hold but because the alternative to holding it is not. The only other possibility, that the fire was sufficient to break the anchor but not to eliminate the source, that the things were reduced to dormancy rather than to nothing, that somewhere in the ash and the turned earth of the eastern field of Brezów there is something that is waiting with the patience of something that has already waited longer than recorded history, is a possibility I cannot afford to examine at length if I intend to continue functioning as a person in the ordinary world. So I believe the fire worked. That is what I know. That is what happened. If you are reading this and you are reading it because some question has led you here, some report, some set of medical findings, some detachment sent to a village that is too quiet, then I am sorry for what I cannot tell you that would help. The only counsel I can offer with any certainty is this: burn what needs to be burned and do not wait for dark. Do not, under any circumstances, wait for dark. Th. Ashworth, London, February 14, 1921. Note appended in a second hand, undated. The author of this document died in London on March 3, 1921, 17 days after the above date. Cause recorded as cardiac failure. He was 32 years old. No other record of the Brezów incident has been located in any accessible archive.